This is JoJo Bell with AAICM, and I'm speaking with Cheniqua Johnson in Worthington. And then, Cheniqua, what year were you born?
1995.
Okay. And where were you born?
Worthington, Minnesota.
Okay. And then, can you tell me a little bit about your mother and father and where they were born, and if they weren't born in Worthington, how did they end up there?
So my mom and my dad were born in the southern states. My mom is from Tennessee and my dad is from Kansas. And they both came to Worthington for work.
Okay. And what work did they do?
So my mom's a nurse and my dad was a worker at the pork plant in Worthington.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about your father's experience at the pork plant in Worthington?
I mean, yeah, I will say that, my father has passed, so,
Mm-hmm.
he was not alive and, worked at the pork plant for 33 years before retiring. He he did several different things and had several different roles in the production process. So he also, he worked in the production line. He had, over the 33 years, I think he worked in several different levels there. And it was towards the early, late 1970s. So one of the first Black families to live here, one of the first Black men to be a part of this community during the large migration from when Kansas, there was a big plant there that closed, and so my dad migrated to Worthington and to Minnesota for a job and started working here, and has stayed here for the rest of his life after that. And so, he had different experiences here, kind of transitioning folks to understanding why they should pay migrant workers the same, Black migrant workers and white production workers were underpaid, and paid differently, because I was still during the early stages and right after the civil rights movement. So the transition from pay, from equity, from lawsuits for wages, from union advocacy, was all very, very different. And, my godfather was my father's best friend, and he was the president of UCW, which is a local union here. And the two of them, as well as several other Black workers at the plant, did a lot of advocacy surrounding workers' wages, equal pay, workers' rights. And so it was really a transformative process here in this community that a lot of older African Americans were a part of. So my father was in his 90s when he passed, and so we have an intergenerational family, and that's different too.
Okay. And then you mentioned your mother was a nurse. Do you know anything about her experience in Worthington as a nurse?
I mean, my mom's been a nurse since she was 18, so she's done nursing for a majority of her life as well. And when she moved to Minnesota, it was to leave, Tennessee and really look for more opportunities. But she has always wanted to be a nurse and take care of folks, and that's just her. That's something that she really enjoys doing. And even now, she's a caregiver, she's a big heart, and that's what drew her to nursing. She worked a lot primarily with elderly folks and people with disabilities. So she spent the last 5-6 years working directly with folks who are dealing with dementia, so in-home health, nursing homes, just around providing care services for those that are struggling with dementia and those that have disabilities. And so that's her work, and that's what she does. She's a certified nursing assistant, so she's not a registered nurse, but she's been doing that for years, and it's something that for her makes her a really senior person in her team. So I think her experience is somewhat different because she didn't, she lived in Worthington and transitioned from a big city to a small town, and it was different for her, but definitely something that she's now come accustomed to. She really enjoys being, in a small town versus a big city now because she can get to where she needs to be as she gets older. But yeah, she packed up and moved and left and was on the search for something else, settled here in large respect in Worthington specifically because of my father. So,
Hmm. And how would you characterize your neighborhood in Worthington, where you grew up?
how would I characterize my neighborhood in Worthington?
Hmm.
Now or like at the time of when I grew up?
Yeah, I would say when you grew up.
Um, I mean, it's so different because when I grew up here and how I grew up here and now how it is now, like, is way more. It's it's different. So, um, just different demographics, different, like, the property itself is not different. Like, like, my mother lives down the street from where we grew up, so I literally look out my window and I see the apartment building that we grew up in, and it's still there. So, and infrastructure wise, it's not very different. We're just kind of a community that is, uh, is so diverse and rich in stories. I think that sometimes those stories aren't shared enough, so the history gets lost. There are so many different, kind of small families, of small communities, and a lot of diverse stories and different backgrounds. We have a mixture of people who are born and raised here, grew up here, teachers who've lived here for years, who now their kids are here and they grew up here, and that cycle that has continued. We have, and then you have, new immigrant families that have immigrated to the United States and migrated to Minnesota, and, first generation citizens and are raising their kids and families here as well. And, you have people who moved here because of the opportunities and different job opportunities as neighboring towns have shut down different schools and et cetera. So it's a complex, small town. It's a town that, and I would say, like, where I grew up was, at the time when I grew up, it was a town that for me was home and felt homely, and it was like a small community. It was a very small community. Everyone knows everyone. Yeah.
Okay. And what schools did you attend throughout your youth?
So we had a elementary school here that I attended for 1 year because they closed it and built a new one. So I went to, like, it was with Central. So it was Central Elementary. That school was closed, and then they opened up Worthington Prairie Elementary School. Um, and that's where I went to elementary school after kindergarten, and so up until the 5th grade. And then afterwards went to the Worthington Junior High School, which is still here, and the Worthington High School, which is also still here. They're the main schools of the district, District 518.
Mhm. And then, so you said there was a bit of diversity in your neighborhood. Is that the same for the schools you went to? And then what were some of the experiences you had going through the school system in Worthington?
Yeah, so they're diverse now. I think that's really important because when I was going to school, I was often, I look back at some of my pictures, and as years went on, there were a lot more diversities that continued, but like through elementary school and, into junior high, there was more migration and immigration to Worthington, and I went from being sometimes the only Black kid or the only person of color in classes, on teams, in music, to being around students and friends and having friends and kids with me that looked like me, some that shared my experiences and some that could relate to me in different ways. And so, and to now where the schools are primarily, where the majority of students are biracial, are students of color, are, you know, black and brown, and that has changed. I look, you know, even now when you look at, when I look at my senior class pictures and, you know, volleyball pictures and things that I played as a kid growing up to the teams, the volleyball teams now, the soccer teams now, I notice that there's all of these minorities and one or two Caucasian students. But I personally, like, that to me, it seems like a lot of growth in our community. And so it's changed. It's definitely changed in some ways, about that particular. So I just believe that because my experience was different. I did get used to being often the only person of color in the spaces that I was in the classes that I was in, the courses that I took. So it was one of those things that I felt like, you know, I was in band, and I sometimes when they would have certain, I remember, you know, not necessarily always understanding how I was different from someone else, and race wasn't really talked about as much. I didn't really see myself as needing to express or talk about how I was different or how my blackness was different than my students, like my fellow peers. And so that was something that was really weird to me, kind of discovering through college after that, was because, like, growing up, we never really talked about it. We just kind of, everyone's the same and we don't know. I don't know. It changed a lot, and that was kind of the majority of my growing up. Like, the things that were similar were the things that a lot of us focused on. The things that were different, we really didn't talk about.
Hmm. Yeah, so that brings me to the next question. So it seems like maybe later in life you were starting to explore the blackness you were talking about. Were there any organizations that existed in Worthington that catered or talked about Black history or Black culture as you were growing up, or is that something you really had to dig into later?
Yeah, I still don't know a lot about Black history. And I say that admittedly because when I growing up here in Worthington, I think that was the biggest thing that I was robbed of. I was born on June 19th and didn't know what Juneteenth was until I went to college and started hearing about the Juneteenth celebrations in Minneapolis. Like, I didn't know the historical weight of my birthday, and just in general, like, what that means to celebrate that. I had no idea what Kwanzaa was. I didn't know beyond, you know, folks that were mentioned in our history books. Like, I had no idea some of the folks that have done major history in our community in Minnesota. Like, I didn't know who Josie Johnson was. I didn't know who Mahmoud Al-Qadi was. I didn't know who Dr. Samuel Myers was. I didn't know who Professor John Wright was. Like, I had no idea about the moral hall takeover at the University of Minnesota. I didn't know about any of the major, you know, Roy Wilson, Hubert Humphrey. I had no idea. Hubert Humphrey's a white man, yes, but I didn't know anything about their roles in Minnesota history at all. And that was not talked about in our community. It was not taught to me. And in some ways, that, I think, was an issue. Like, I would identify that as where I felt like I had been, in some ways, robbed for 18 years of my childhood, because I didn't know. I still, you know, have trying to put together pieces of my identity and the puzzles of Black history that I was not taught growing up.
Hmm. And then just going back to kind of life in your neighborhood, how often did you socialize with your neighbors, and do you ever feel that race was a barrier to that socialization, or do you feel that since race wasn't talked about, it was maybe a different experience?
Yeah, it was definitely a different experience because, like I said, like, I think growing up, in my eyes, you know, people were all the same. So I treated everyone the same, and I talked to all my neighbors the same, you know, like they were just my neighbors, and I feel like that was mutually given. And so, like, I had friends from different cultures in the city, and that's not how I would describe. You know, if you ask me about my friends, I wouldn't be like, oh, my friends are diverse. They're like this. They're Latina. They're that. They're black. It would be like, these are my friends. Here are their names, and like, here's what, you know, their cultures are, and like, we just have fun. You know, like they're nice to me, and I'm nice to them, and we all just get along. And you know, it was when that happens, like, it's really good here. Worthington's very good at getting along. And when tensions come up, or when people have different viewpoints, or things get political, or folks have differences and they try to explain why they're being excluded for conversations, that's where I feel like my hometown has a hard time discussing. But as a child, I wasn't doing that. You know, like, I wasn't trying to question structural racism. I wasn't trying to bring forth issues of mass incarceration. I wasn't talking about the war on drugs. I wasn't talking about police brutality, or, you know, the need for licensing for undocumented immigrants in our community. We weren't talking about those. Like, we were talking about, you know, what's for dinner, how we're going to throw a birthday party, you know, like, what are you going to do this weekend? And that was my upbringing. It was peaceful, really. I didn't have many issues. Like, I was seen as a good kid. Like, I had good grades. I didn't get in trouble very much at all. Had sport, you know, I was involved in sports, and I was vice president of my graduating high school class. I didn't, you know, I had graduated with honors. Like, had the reputation for being the really good kid. And Worthington, like, I was smart. People would talk to me about, you know, they would say great things. You're going to go great places. You're going to do great things. You should be a lawyer. You should, you know, like, I wouldn't say like, oh, this is so good. You know, like, it was very much like, I felt people believed in me and saw my potential and encouraged me most of my childhood to do great and to go to college, to, you know, do the best that I can. I was giving that to my family. I was giving that to my mentors, to my teachers. Like, everyone, you know, was very supportive of me. And I think I still have a lot of people support here now. But I do notice differences when I'm talking or being outspoken about some of these major social issues that we just cannot seem to talk about, or it makes us uncomfortable to address, and it's like a white elephant in the room all the time. And when the white elephant was not there, you know, it was really great. Like, you know, it's something that for me, like, I wasn't even noticing. You know, I was just like, oh, this is
Right.
the way they're supposed to be. We're all the same. I think that argumentatively, I probably would have been a kid that was like, we're all the same. What do you mean? I don't see colors. You know, I don't understand what you're talking about. I don't think I even identified, like, as an African American woman until I understood what that meant.
And so, since you're so woven into the community in Worthington, and it wasn't till later and maybe even now addressing, well, and we'll get to 2018, but addressing some of these social issues, did you ever feel unsafe when you did address some of those social and racial issues with your fellow citizens?
No, I don't think I ever felt like I think for me it was more of a concern so like when I decided to run for office in 2018, when I decided to run for state rep, I think that it was kind of an underlying thing that was just in the back of my mind. Like, when I'm more of I do like to challenge people in the community, and I do like to be outspoken, and I do like to ask really tough questions, and I know that can get under the skins of a lot of my peers and people that are in structural power and are not used to having to answer, especially not for a 24-year-old black kid from Worthington. I think they do react in a way that is, like, you can see sometimes the irritation as they roll their eyes when they're talking to me. But I don't believe that I have personally ever felt like my life does have danger. No.
Hmm. And then, can you tell us about, for you personally, your family, or even if you think about the city, what was the most maybe notable historic event that happened in Worthington, and if it's something that happened when you were growing up, Can you tell us
Mhm.
about how it affected your community or your family?
So I would say here in Worthington right now, I think that one of the I would say there's two events that kind of affected. Um, the first event I would say that was really that left us all kind of in some ways really numb. I think is where I remember so when 9/11 happened, I was 6 years old, and I went to school that day. Actually, it was in Central High School, and so I went to school there, and I remember started Central Elementary School, and remember getting on the bus, going to school, not necessarily knowing what the day would unfold, and I and slowly, but when we got there, my brother and I, there was one of maybe five others in our class. A lot of kids did not go to school that day. It was because they had seen or heard word of of news. And my family, we had not, because my mom was just getting ready. She hadn't had time to turn on TV, getting us all ready, and we had afternoon, morning kindergarten, afternoon kindergarten. My brother was in evenings in first grade, so he was at school, but I was in the afternoon class, the later starting class of kindergarten, and my mom had not been watching anything, did not know what happened, so she sent me to school. And I remember getting there, and everyone was kind of in this one room, and we were all just watching on television 9/11 happen, and there was just dead silence in the room. No one was talking, no one kind of really knew or could explain. And I just remember after all of our family, all of our parents running coming to school, picking us all up, and just really as a kid not really comprehending what was going on. And I still did, it didn't. I don't think it ever, especially not those years. It wasn't until later on when I would understand what was going on. But at that time, I was just kind of what is happening? I didn't even probably know that I was in New York at the time, or that was in our country. I had no idea or even understanding the fundamental impact of why my mom was writing to me and hugging me with tears in her eyes, and bringing me home, and why we couldn't go to school, or why the school was on lockdown, and why everyone was not, why people were nervous and scared. And I remember it being explained to us by our teachers later of this is why we have to be careful. But it was just something that there's so much pain in the community and so much stuff that wasn't talked about in the community, and people were just really confused. I know as a kid I was just really confused. And then you fast forward to something not a comparison in them, but just a second event was the ICE raid that happened in Worthington, which raided thousands and deported thousands of undocumented immigrants at the JBS plant at Swift. And I was older. I want to say I was maybe 11 or 12 when that happened. And I remember some of my classmates crying because their family members were not home when they went home. And, they would get there and it was on news and everyone was just, again, sad on there were things that happened, this major event that happened, sometimes ripped apart families. People were going home to empty households. Kids and students, friends of mine, were going home to their parents being gone and not being told what was happening, not really understanding, but then they weren't in school the next day. And again, so many unanswered questions, so much stuff that was very painful for a lot of people that were living through it. Those two events I still remember now, because I remember at the time I did, it's not necessarily understanding or grasping just how crazy those events are, or what complex they are, but just knowing how even in towns like Worthington, you feel, it's you felt the direct impact, the silence, the heaviness of what was happening. As a 6-year-old, even as an 11-year-old, and there wasn't, it's not the class stuff. Those conversations were happening at home. I'd go home and I'd talk to my mom about what was happening, but I would also, just be thankful that I could come home and my mom and my dad were both there, and in both situations, it was me, my mom, my dad, my brother, we were a family, and we would go home and talk to each other. And yeah, and really not thinking like, oh, what about family members in Worthington that don't have that? Because I was just like, I'm going home, I'm going to talk to my mom, I'm going to talk to my dad. It was a lot. When those things happened, we were impacted indirectly, but I had a place to go back and talk to, and persons to talk to, and mom and dad to talk to and confide in and ask questions, and a friend group that was going through something that could explain to me and could tell me what was happening. And yeah.
Hmm. So I'm sure, the ICE raid affected you even though you were pretty young. Maybe it even affected your politics, but could you tell us about your run for House Rep in 2018 and just some of the experiences you had out campaigning, and then maybe a little bit about, how those past experiences influenced your platform and what it was like as a Black woman running in Worthington?
hmm Yeah, I mean, I ultimately I had decided to run for office, for a couple of reasons in particular. One was because I genuinely believe that young people should be more involved in politics and in these roles, and not just as people's campaign managers or, doing the data or handling all the electronic and technology things, but also being a huge part in the decision-making process, and wanted to run with that in mind. And as a Black woman, being the first Black woman in Southwest Minnesota to run for state rep, as well, so as the first, to be endorsed by the default party and all of those things, in Worthington in particular. And sometimes people are like, why did you run? Why did you run in my hometown? Because I really genuinely believe that the work needs to start here. And I think that places like Worthington we really could benefit from having more diverse leadership. And it's difficult because I know right now, we are a town, Worthington's a town with 42% people of color. A third of the population is under the age of 35. A third of the population is and 35 to 50, and it's really split like that. And then you have a lot of people that are biracial, minority identifying, Hispanic, non-Hispanic. It's just different. It's a lot of different cultures and ethnicities, but then when you look at our government, we don't have that diversity. It's nowhere. It's not in our school board. It's not in our state legislation. It's not in our city council. It's not in our county commissioners. It's not anywhere. It's nowhere to be found. It's not in our school administration. Our principals are not minorities. There is no bilingual assistant principals. There is no superintendent that's biracial. It's homogenous across the board of just non-white, of all white identifying members. And I think that that's a huge issue. And it leads to my final point of trying to bridge the connection between and raise awareness around the importance of why community members, everyday community members, that this is not their paid job, this is not their need to be involved in the conversations. We were running on a platform of, we want to hear from community, we want community to understand that they can ask questions of their state reps, that, I was door knocking, my campaign was door knocking, phone banking, and a lot of people were telling us that it was the first time they'd been called. And the first time they'd been talked to, or the first time someone came to the door. People were confused when I would come to Westbrook and to Walnut Grove and to Mountain Lake, some of these small towns that they're like, what, why, you're door knocking, and you're running. And it was this conversation all the time of yes. And unlike my experience personally in the Twin Cities with some of the campaigns that I've worked on, people get so annoyed in the Twin Cities sometimes when you knock on the door because they're like, oh my goodness, another person talking to me. What do you want? And Worthington, it was you're door knocking. You're talking to me. That doesn't happen. It's very rare that we talk to someone on the ballot. And I don't find that. I ran and wanted to highlight the problem with that. There's a flaw in the fact that people that sit on our city council have not met and talked to a town of less than 12,000 people, but have served in office for almost 10 years. And that's, something that I would see and hear overwhelmingly so. And running for office here was really, I think, one of the best decisions that I've made, and running as a running as my authentic self, like my issues or things that I was speaking on or things that were passionate to me. And I didn't water them down for anyone. I didn't really change them. And I wanted to make sure that people understood, like, yes, this is in part too because we need more Black people. We need more people of color to run in these areas, and that you can do it, and you can do it safely, and you can do it well. It was very important to me to run a campaign that did not get into any trouble, did not have questions, because I understood that my campaign was not just about, it wasn't about, I argued that it wasn't really necessarily even about the win or not win. It was about what happens when a Black kid, when the little Black Cheniqua, who's now currently in Worthington Junior High School getting ready to graduate, or Worthington Middle School getting ready to graduate, looking forward to their future, like, wants to run for office in this town. They don't see any representation that looks like them. We barely see any women. So my first Black professor was when I went to the University of Minnesota. I didn't come in contact with very many people that looked like me in structural influencing and power. I didn't actually know what that meant as a kid. I had a vision, but the vision itself did not include me in Worthington. And I think that that's the problem, because if I couldn't see myself here, but I'm living through this town every day and living through this experience every day, that's when it becomes like you don't belong here. Like if I think and I see that, oh, this isn't for me, and that's exactly what I thought sometimes as a kid. I always knew that I would leave here and leave Worthington. And my goal vision out of college was I want to graduate and go to the University of Minnesota, because, it never once dawned on me to go to Minnesota West here. It didn't actually, I had no real framework of how I fitted into Worthington. My goal for so long was to get out of my hometown. And I think that is the goal for a lot of Black kids in Worthington. There are a lot of Black women in particular that have moved out of Worthington and are now doing things and have different platforms like me and more, like people who leave here and then they go be a star at a basketball team, or they go to an Ivy League school and they were told they couldn't do that here, or they are now doing pageants and people are acknowledging their beauty and their strength, and the jobs that they're getting pay 3 times over what they would get here, because they would their credentials and things would not be validated but ignored, where I didn't see a vision in Worthington. Even as a kid, I didn't see myself staying here. And now this run, and that run for me was a lot of, personally, just of I'm returning back to Worthington because I want to start having real conversations about the fact that I even have to run for office because I couldn't get a county job here, or I couldn't get a city job. I have to run to be involved in government because you won't invite me to the table.
Right. So did you feel like your run was highlighting how, even though you were born and raised in Worthington, there was a sense of belonging missing as a Black person?
Yes, I do think that. And I know that that's something that I really did talk about, is I wanted to, we had a very inclusive campaign team of people from different voices, from different ethnicities, folks that had knew each other but maybe never worked together. And that was a huge part of our team, and a part of our, really our mission as a group was we want to include as many people as we can into this space and into this into these roles, into this campaign team, into this movement building, because we want them to see that they have a voice in this and that they belong in this work, and that it's actually okay to ask a city council member to let you sit in on a meeting. It's actually okay to challenge a state rep if you don't agree with their political viewpoints, in hopes of actually trying to move something forward, and that there are people that will vote for you when you do that. That was really important for us as a whole, and important for me as a candidate, to just kind of echo the need for that work. And I think people are really starting to, we still have a white majority here, so I think white people in Worthington that have lived here for as long as I have or more are really starting to ask themselves questions about how they can show up to help and better serve their students, and how they can be allies in the work that is sometimes hard and really difficult to deal with. Even down to pronouncing my name correctly, or having to address me properly. having to think about going to the ballot in November and voting for Cheniqua, the kid that they raised or the kid that they remember in elementary school that was this and that, and she's saying Black Lives Matter, and she's saying, you know, we need to do the best that we can to get rid of ICE and the things that are enforcing and ripping apart our community. Like, they have to have conversations with me with why I'm not, you know, why I'm trying to raise awareness around women's rights and things that they maybe aren't comfortable talking about. And then on the other side, you have people who've been waiting, like people, minority voices that are waiting to be heard and were really excited that someone was actually brave enough to do it.
And then lastly, is there anything you want us to know about Black rural life in Worthington? You know, things that maybe people don't know, maybe in the cities, or just some or some thought you want to leave us about that experience.
I think that this idea of that Black rural, so at one point in history, you know, in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, Black rural Minnesota was a thing, was like, you know, 90s, like there was a large amount of movements of like Black people, from workers' rights to like, even just in general, the music area, like that we had performing artists in Worthington that were Black men a lot of the time. My father was a Freemason, so there was groups of folks that were Black, like were Black and leading in this work. And the thing about some of the stories here is that they've been erased, and sometimes eradicated in like this in history. Like I didn't hear about them. Like if I didn't have my dad, who was essentially older, being able to tell me the stories of the good old days in Worthington and in rural Minnesota, I wouldn't have known as much as I know about my dad. Like I wouldn't have known about the issues that the pork plant was having with paying Black workers less than they were paying white workers. I wouldn't have known that there was a lawsuit in Worthington talking about wages and wage stuff, and that was warranted in the result of why people are now paid and how the salaries now have to be said in public and how they have to be disclosed and how the union had come about and how folks were now, like, you know, able to unionize in that community. I wouldn't have known about that. I wouldn't have known that if it wasn't for like the Black foods that are still here in Worthington, that, you know, Al McFarland, who's in the Twin Cities, that his father was also in Worthington or had roots in Worthington. Like a lot of people have had roots in rural Minnesota at some point in time, even if they have migrated to the Minneapolis area, the Twin Cities, or Rondo, or wherever. And I think that that's really important of just, I think, trying to connect them sometimes. Like, especially for those that still have family in some of these rural neighborhoods in Minnesota, I really would be, that's why I'm really excited about the work that you guys are doing and telling this narrative of rural Minnesota, because it looks different. Rural Minnesota looks different now, but it also has been diverse at some point, especially with Black people. And I feel like that was, you know, we were the rural farmers at one point. You know, we did have the storefronts here. We were the people who had the little shops and boutiques downtown before people moved to the metropolitan area. And I would be curious to hear that story, and I want to hear more about it because I don't know about it. Like, I don't, and sometimes I can feel like you're the only ones out here, and you're like, you know, like, there's only a few of us out here now, and most of us have moved to the cities, especially in Minnesota. And that's just not true. There are a lot of Black families out here still in rural Minnesota. Black, African American, African, however you identify. I feel like to me they're all the same. Like, we are all out here in this community, and, you know, there's so much not being taught in rural Minnesota. I don't hear about the same knowledge, and we don't have social justice conversations. There is no structural racism course. There's no African American studies in Minnesota West. There's none of that. The culture, that curriculum is not available to me as a Black kid in Worthington. I have to leave my town to hear about that. And, you know, I'd really like for, you know, our strong advocates in the metropolitan areas that are focused on this, you know, like the Black Immigrants Collective, Black Voices, you know, Black Lives Matter representatives and organizers to consider doing, you know, workshops around race, around Blackness, around like different privileges, like all of it, around that aspect of leadership and curriculum with some of the communities in the rural parts, and not assuming that we don't want to know about it, but knowing that we do, just kind of including us in that discussion because we don't hear about that enough. Like we do not. I know I did not in my experience. Like I was not able to get that ringing. I didn't celebrate Juneteenth. I didn't celebrate Kwanzaa. I didn't celebrate Hanukkah. I didn't know anything about those things at all. I had no idea what they were, and I'm still figuring it out. So, like, I don't. It's just kind of like we need y'all. We need people that can teach those things to the communities here too. And I feel like we never even had a black guest speaker. You know, like we just didn't, and I didn't even, so I just didn't expect it. You know, like I was sitting listening to live streams all the time. But we never did. We never did. They never invited someone to speak at our student. We have a school of like over my graduating class was 100 something, but now the schools themselves can be around 2,000 students each, which doesn't seem like a big number, but it is in a small town, and we never had a speaker of color come in and talk about any of it at all. So, like, I think I might have been one of the, like, I had to go lead a leadership call with a discussion with students at the college on Black History Month. And I'm sure I might have been the only Black person talking about Black History Month. Black History Month isn't even celebrated in our schools.
Wow.
So it's a really important, I think that part is just like really important of just like knowing that there are students growing up that don't understand the magnitude of Black History Month in rural Minnesota because Black History Month is not celebrated here. It is not talked about in our history courses unless students bring it up about it being Black History Month or like they express it and we find a way to express it on our own. It's not something that we go to school and we see Happy Black History Month, you guys, or Happy, Asian American Heritage Month. Like none of that happens at all. So there's no celebration downtown. There's no sales. There's just nothing. It's just nothing there. And it's still, I literally came back this year. This was like to talk to students about Black History Month in last year because they were like, and it was a class that people talking, but they haven't done anything. It's just not done. And that's the thing that's just really frustrating. And I think sometimes it's not on us. Like I'm not saying it's on like Black people in the metro teachers. It's like no. I'm just saying like there are students that are currently experiencing spaces where they do not hear enough about our history and our story. And I feel like we as a community really could start bridging some of that gap for our folks, including the Black students and Black young people in Worthington and places like my hometown and in rural communities in Minnesota.
Well, thank you, Cheniqua, for sitting down and speaking with me about your experiences in Worthing today. So that concludes this interview. And I want to thank you very much for your time.